Hi, and welcome to another episode of About the Authors TV. I'm your host, Jake Brown. The New Yorker once wrote that the publication of a John Irving novel is always a major literary event. And indeed, Irving is one of those literary lions that writers love to write about as much as readers love to read. Time magazine and a cover profile offered their own deep dive into why for the better part of 60 years, he's been a man who needs no introduction. Irving's popularity is not hard to understand. His world is really according to nearly everyone. It's impossible to imagine the American or international literary landscape without him. He's as close to one gets as a contemporary Dickens in the scope of his celebrity and the level of his achievement. His weighty novels are commonly and rightly considered American masterpieces. They've been translated into more than 50 languages, sold tens of millions of copies, and won too many awards to list here. The New York Times has doubled down on the fact that for half a century and counting, Irving has remained more than popular. He's a populist, determined to keep alive the Dickensian tradition that revels in colorful set pieces and teaches moral lessons. While the Globe and Mail in his adopted hometown of Toronto has added that the author offers a faith in patient storytelling and the conviction that narrative hunger is part of our essence. Beginning back in 1968 when the Saturday Review hailed his debut Setting Free the Bears as astonishing and immediately identified Irving as a writer of uncommon imaginative power, promising of the future that whatever he writes, it will be worth reading. A prophecy that proved itself true as each of the next few novels that followed marked important early steps in his evolution towards becoming what the Associated Press declared was one of the very finest writers alive today and a premier storyteller, in the opinion of career-long fan of the Los Angeles Times, who crowned him master of the tragic comic and among the first rank of contemporary novelists. His wholly original mid and later 1970s work like The Water Method Man and The 158-Pound Marriage support these assertions. While The Hotel New Hampshire would launch Irving into an era where, as CBS News reported, he began writing blockbusters, starting with The World According to Garp, which landed John on the cover of Time magazine and created what the Wall Street Journal called Garp Mania, reporting that the real popular groundswell began when the book arrived in cheap mass-market editions, and word of mouth was accelerated by a now famous promotional campaign that included bumper stickers and golf caps, emblazoned with the slogan, "I believe in Garp." Mr. Irving, young and photogenic, posed in Playboy in a wrestler's singlet. His novel won the 1980 National Book Award in the short-lived paperback category, and went on to sell in the millions. Once, maybe twice in a decade, the mousy little genre of literary fiction is allowed a massive cultural movement that permeates society and makes an author a recognizable celebrity. And the early 1980s, John Irving was the man. The Hotel New Hampshire, turned into a hit film co-starring Rob Lowe and Jodie Foster, was praised as a high-wire act of dazzling virtuosity by Cosmopolitan, while the author would win his own Academy Award for adapting the now mythic The Cider House Rules, which Variety at the time argued represents one of the most successful attempts yet at filming the work of popular American novelist John Irving. While Electric Literature wrote years later that Irving's 1985 novel, banned in many states, is probably the most famous depiction of abortion in American literature. Stephen King called A Prayer for Owen Meany a rare creation in the somehow exhausted world of late 20th century fiction, and the hits continued into the 1990s with A Son of a Circus and A Widow for 1 year, which became another literary phenomenon among readers and critics alike, from USA Today musing that Irving is among the few novelists who can write a novel about grief and fill it with ribald humor soaked in irony, to Entertainment Weekly's declaration that in the sprawling, deeply felt novel, John Irving has delivered his best since The World According to Garp. Like a warm bath, it's a great pleasure to immerse yourself in. Kicking off his second century as one of America's most revered wordsmiths with the fourth hand, which the Washington Post celebrated as vintage Irving. He followed with other hits like Until I Find You, Last Night and Twisted River, called absolutely unmissable by the Financial Times. And in a reflection of his universal popularity across every genre and geography, the Nashville Scene observed that along the way he's become perhaps more than any other living writer, sort of a novelist for whom the term was always capitalized 100 years ago. A crafter of rich, complex books that chronicle not only the lives of the people who populate them, but also their generation. Avenue of Mysteries was another smash bestseller that People magazine singled out as captivatingly original, with humor, pathos, and acute observations. Once again, Irving charms by blending the fantastical with what is deeply affectingly real. While the Associated Press found that the novel's tone moves easily from drama to comedy to tragedy, the perfect mix for a film adaptation someday. Casting will probably take time. These characters are so unique. Until then, lose yourself in this tale from one of America's preeminent storytellers. More recently, he's returned with the 912-page long The Last Chairlift, which even made Good Morning America caution that it's long, before giving the glowing reassurance to readers to not let this dissuade you. Let it excite you that there's that much new John Irving material to read. I mean, John Irving. His first novel in 7 years takes place in Aspen, Colorado in 1941. It follows Little Ray, a former national skier, who moves back east to have her son. Years later, her grown son returns to the Hotel Jerome in Aspen, where he encounters some ghosts. Read on, you won't be able to stop. And we are absolutely honored that he's joining us today to talk about his iconic contributions to literature. Mr. Irving, welcome to the show. National Public Radio once wrote that any fan of John Irving's novels will find similarities between his characters and his own childhood. Please turn the page back there with us for a few moments to the glorious one when you first found storytelling and storytelling first found you.
There was a curious simultaneity with a couple of things in my life. I was read to as a child. My grandmother read to me a lot. And I remember more the experience of just listening to someone read and wishing I could do it than I do really retain the memories of what was read to me. But I remember how enraptured I was by someone else's voice and the hearing a story. And I think that carried over when I began to read, that I was a slow reader largely because I read many of the things I was reading, as it were, out loud to myself. I sort of formed the words, I said the words as I read them, which certainly slowed me down, but reading slowly is no penalty. It's a penalty in school, but that notwithstanding.
You've often referred to yourself as a 19th century writer at heart. Would you elaborate a bit on why you felt this way once you began reading works by Hawthorne and Herman Melville and, of course, Charles Dickens?
I had both a gift and a fright upon the experience at age 15 of reading Dickens's Great Expectations and deciding thereupon that I wanted to be a novelist, but only if I could be a novelist like Dickens. So that at a very young age, when I was just about to begin 9th grade, I had given myself a daunting ambition to be an old-fashioned writer. Among my very few friends my age who were readers, who even liked novels, they all despised the 19th century novels we were made to read in school, but they were the model of the form for me. Melville, Dickens, Hardy, George Eliot, those were the writers, but Great Expectations in particular. Well, simultaneous to that, my desire to be old-fashioned before I began, I began to see foreign films with subtitles, or if not always subtitles, but I associated something to do with the seriousness of subtitles, of having actually to read a movie in addition to watching it. I associated that with part of my literary and formative education. I had not realized until the age of, until I was an early teenager, 15, 16, that there were better films in an artistic sense made outside the United States than the great Westerns and all the other junk I had seen in American movies. Indeed, as I sort of learned only later, a couple of those great Westerns were also made by a European, Zinnemann, who made High Noon. Well, they were sort of my most formative tastes, I guess.
How do you feel reflecting back that those influences filtered down into your native compositional preferences and signature stylistically as you began early original writing?
Certainly, I was wedded to plot, to character-driven stories, to the power of narrative storytelling. And by narrative storytelling, I mean a novel that is more compelling to read 200 pages later than it was on page 20, because you were driven to find out what's going to happen. And the only reason you care about what's going to happen is that you care about the people it's going to happen to. The author has taken pains to make you, if not love a character, at least be pulling for that character. But at the same time, in my opinion, if it's a good novel, you're also fearful for characters. You think, uh-oh, there's a designation for this character, and it's not good. Now, I was 2 years old, or 17, when I read Moby Dick. And that describes for me how accurately Melville had known exactly how that novel ended as he was beginning it. Dickens wasn't so good at endings. Dickens was in many novels, a fly by the seat of his pants guy. But Melville knew where he was going. And I saw myself as someone who was slow enough or lacking in confidence to the degree that I would not begin a short story or a novel until I knew what the ending was. And that did become a driving motivation and a method. Make a storyline, have a cast of characters, know what the most important thing that's going to happen, which is always, or should be, in my estimation, the last thing that happens. And everything is designed to lead you toward it. How can there be foreshadowing if you don't know where you're going? And I realized that in the great 19th century novels, it was the foreshadowing I most appreciated. So I don't, for all the years I taught so-called creative writing, I never imposed my method on my students. I never said, this is the way you or other writers should approach the novel. I recognize that the way fiction writers approached a novel was every which way, and they had to do it their own way. But my own method was plain to me. I had to do it. I had to write a character-driven, ending-driven, plotted novel. And occasionally, knowing that the 19th century novel was already out of date or unfashionable among my peers, when I was a beginning writer, I thought, you've kind of saddled yourself with a seriously unpopular model here. But it was the only model I could follow.
Good thing you did. While you were attending Phillips Exeter Academy, who were any teachers who rooted your talent on as it first began to bud?
Oh, yeah. The father of my closest friend, who was, like me, a fellow faculty brat at the academy, had long time recognized my interest in writing And I trusted him to read my stories, my first fiction. In fact, I was so close to him. He was like a second father, that he told me it would not be appropriate for me to be a student in one of his classes. He never was one of my English teachers at the academy. I understood why, but for many years at Exeter, he was my first and only reader. And then he told me, this man, George Bennett, told me, when Fred Buechner was joining the faculty as the minister and the teacher of the history of religion courses. And George said, you should show your writing to this man. He's a practicing novelist. And Fred Buechner couldn't have been more helpful and welcoming. And so I think those experiences as a teenager opened me to the prospect of listening to a good editor, listening to an older writer, which made me, by the time I went to the Iowa workshop, very open to and receptive to Kurt Vonnegut as the first reader of my first novel. How lucky was that?
The New York Times would call the famed Iowa Writers' Workshop creative writing's premier writing factory by the time you arrived there in the late 1960s and were studying under the great Kurt Vonnegut. Where do you feel like he helped you further expand your education and boundaries as a writer, given the new ones you'd be pushing with your own novels just a short time later?
Kurt was happy to be teaching writing, even though at the time I first met him, he was largely regarded as a science fiction hack. He had been relegated as he had been judged by his paperback originals. The judge, talk about being judged by your book covers. He was. And many of the students in Iowa were such snobs that they wouldn't take the time to read his books and discover that he was much more than a sci-fi genre writer, that there was something really special about this guy. So his first classes in Iowa were very underpopulated. And the only people in them were people who had actually read him. And if you'd read him, you thought, oh, this guy's different. This guy is not as he has been judged. And those, the not as he has been judged thing was also important. The fact that Kurt Vonnegut had been disparaged or dismissed as a sci-fi writer, and then suddenly was lionized as a literary figure, was as instructive and encouraging to me as the incontrovertible truth that there is no greater novel than Moby Dick that has been as vilified by reviewers as that novel was. And I used to tell my students at Iowa, when you publish a first book or a second book and you get some bad reviews, please go and read Melville's reviews. And then you'll know who's stupid.
Time Magazine's been a career-long fan of yours from the late 1960s onward, when they heralded your debut, Setting Free the Bears, as truly remarkable, a complex and moving novel that encompassed the longings and agonies of youth, and then The Water Method Man, as a blend of brutal reality and hallucination, comedy and pathos, that tied together into a rich, unified tapestry. Weren't you a student at the Institute of European Studies in Vienna in your early 20s during the writing of both of these early works, and how autobiographical were each?
Yes, I had a junior year abroad in Vienna, and I loved it. It was my first experience and I had chosen Vienna among other places I could have gone, because it seemed to me to be a kind of melting pot in history. I found it was a fascinating experience. And because I revered my stepfather, a history teacher, to begin with a historical novel was both natural to me. I read a lot of history, but also it was a kind of it was a kind of comfort zone. I thought, well, needing to know as I did how it ends, if you write a historical novel, well, you do know that much. You do know how the history ends. So that there was a certain comfort in keeping it historical. And I've never lost my liking for history or the historical novel. My novels always look back at a time. I do not write a contemporary novel of the moment, especially in the political novels. I'm always looking back. So I don't think of myself as at all prophetic. It's easier to look back and recognize what has happened. I'm not a forecaster. I'm not that kind of fiction writer. I have heard said in my praise about the sexual politics of my novel that how prescient I was, or how forward-looking I was, and I say no, I wasn't. It's how backward the sexual politics are and increasingly become. Don't give me credit for seeing the future. Look at the politics themselves and see how regressive they are. If anything, it was a kind of a parody of exaggeration. In other words, I had a surgery on my urethra at a time when it was neither especially painful nor long lasting, but the very fact that I had a surgery, it seemed to me was kind of a joke. Well, in Trumper's case, of course, I made it a kind of life's mission. I made it far more symbolically important than it ever became, thankfully, to me. So I think I saw in The Water Method Man an opportunity for both comic but truthful exaggeration. And I think I had one of the best times writing that novel, in that I was aware from the beginning, and this probably speaks more to Kurt Vonnegut's influence than anything else. I was aware from the beginning that I wanted to write just a comedy. And I did not have another agenda, but to be entertaining.
Well, you certainly succeeded there. You write poignantly about the sexual revolution raging during the mid-1970s via the crazy to some notion of swinging, where two couples swapped sexual partners. Was this a phenomenon going on around you that you felt was irresistible not to capture on the page in the 158-pound marriage?
I also thought I could make it, at the time, there's an epigraph from John Hawkes in there. There's an epigraph from Maddox Ford. Those were two writers who addressed that subject or dealt with that subject, I think, more quote unquote seriously than I took it. Once again, I thought I was still riding the horse of truthful exaggeration. Remember, that's a darker subject, but it comes from the same vein as The Water Method Man before it. It doesn't have any of the historical gravity of the first novel, Setting Free the Bears. So I was still in a mode of truthful exaggeration. Certainly, at my time in Iowa, half the young couples, including half the young couples with children I knew, were engaging in or experimenting with some kind of so-called open marriage, which even at the time struck me as an invitation to chaos and disillusionment. But I kept saying, okay, make it real, but keep it funny. Make it real, but keep it funny. But the exaggeration was kind of key. If I'd written that novel sort of later in my writing career, I think it would have been much more serious, or it would have included some of the more seriously political agenda of my so-called sexually political novels, of which I would call The World According to Garp the first. But I didn't start taking the politics of sexuality altogether seriously until that fourth novel.
If we may say, it worked brilliantly to have an unnamed narrator. Was that your decision from the beginning, and did it make sense to keep him anonymous throughout the novel?
Yeah. I thought it was, it also struck me as the least prejudicial way. That as in a way that anonymity is the most omniscient of all, maybe.
Long before he introduced himself on the silver screen, with Robin Williams memorably embodying T.S. Garp, for the generations of viewers who've grown up with this iconic character on the page, we'd love to talk about The World According to Garp, which Parade magazine highlighted among its other unique distinctions, that it combines a number of tropes, wrestling, sex, and writing fiction that occur and recur throughout your work, with the freshness, however, of them being deployed for the first time all at once. And wrestling as a theme is long run autobiographically throughout your entire body of work, with New York Magazine affirming that with your status as an ex-wrestler whose arm bears a tattoo of a wrestler's starting circle, Irving's passed his passion onto his characters, most notably Garp, and 2 of his 3 children. Why did you feel this was a coming-of-age skill you wanted to thrust upon Garp? Was it both for his character's own growth, as well as the overarching thematic value to the broader story?
Both autobiographical but coincidental in this respect. It wasn't designed that my desire to be a writer at age 15 was coincident with my starting to wrestle. And yet I think it was of considerable benefit to me with hindsight, I can see it now, that these 2 disciplines entered my life simultaneously. And I wouldn't make the argument that they are identical. But in my case, the overlapping similarities were obvious. I was not a gifted student. I was always slow academically. I took my slowness as an advantage when I was writing stories, because it fit the deliberation of writing toward an ending I had already foreseen. Also very deliberate. Also a very slow setup process. Before you can write a novel that's ending driven, you have to have spent a lot of time working out an ending. So there's a lot of deliberation, repetition, over and over again, ness about it. Well, I also learned at that time, since wrestling was the only sport I ever did with any degree of success, I also learned from a very truthful coach that I could see for myself that I wasn't the best of athletes, certainly not a natural athlete. And that my success as a wrestler was dependent more on my preparation, my deliberation, my defensiveness, than it was on my trusting in my spontaneity. My coach essentially told me, don't trust in your spontaneity. If there's a mix-up out there, you're going to be on the bottom. He taught me how to sort of be deliberate, be painstaking, and stick to a plan. Very like the way I write a novel, and I could meet with not great success, but with moderate success as a wrestler. I always knew, and it was a help to me, not a hindrance. It was a help to me that my first coach said, reflexes, speed, explosiveness, these things do not come to you naturally. You're not a great athlete. There's a limit to how far you can go in any sport. Because of your athletic limitations. But knowing that, you can be pretty good at something. You can be halfway decent. Well, it served me well. That's all. And it especially served me well in the modeling of Garp's character, which was drawn with that kind of deliberation, as opposed to the spontaneity of his mother Jenny's automatic success because of the outrageousness of what she's done. That she can that her fame or success is natural and happens spontaneously. He isn't of the same makeup. He isn't of the same composition.
Let's talk about that. The New Republic saw something truly original in this work, like so many they hadn't read before, reasoning at the time of its release that nothing in contemporary fiction matches it, courtesy of your blend of gravity and play, which is unique, audacious, almost blasphemous, brilliant, funny, and consistently wise. A work of vast talent, in part no doubt because of the expanse of the relationship and its layered depths that are explored throughout Garp and his mother, Jenny Fields, a feminist World War II field nurse who conceives her son with a dying soldier named Technical Sergeant Garp, before then writing a memoir called A Sexual Subject, which sends her poor son's world spinning into a dizzying and dazzling story that follows, where the Los Angeles Times ultimately concluded after finishing the book that John Irving, it's abundantly clear, is a true artist. Please deconstruct any of the complexities of this mother-son relationship you felt were driving the heartbeat of this 600-page sojourn.
I wanted to be in his point of view. He's envious. He's a little angry at how things have happened for her, and how public her persona and her success both are. But, knowing as I did, or as I always do, how it's going to end, the underlying truth of the story is that whatever the more artistic son sees as his superiority to his mother, she's right. She's right about the way men behave, and she's right about the way he behaves. He is an example of the kind of man she's been targeting, and he enacts himself by his lack of restraint, by his lack of respect for the boundaries of his marriage. He is responsible for what happens to his family. Harsh judgment. But both those reviews that called The World According to Garp a feminist novel, to put it down, or called it a feminist novel in praise. There were both. They're both right. I mean, it is a feminist novel. In truth, The World According to Garp really is The World According to Jenny. The only thing he's right about is the inevitability of death, which he didn't think of. He didn't invent. He gets no credit for that. She sees, the underlying friction that is caused by men who aren't in control or consideration of their sexual desire. And from that novel forward, not least in my most recent novel, The Last Chairlift, I think my novels demonstrate that heterosexual men are the most badly behaved creatures sexually of all the sexual choices available to us. That's the point of my most recent novel, a family novel with one straight guy in it. And guess who's the most badly behaved sexually? He is. Well, that goes back to Garp. Jenny's right.
Where did you conjure up the fantastically fitting name Garp?
I needed a monosyllabic utterance that someone who couldn't speak, as someone who's been damaged in a war, it's the only sound he can make. So I needed a name that, sounded like something less than speech, but was distinctive.
Once you typed the end and your publisher took it from there, readers and critics alike soon followed, sending the book rocketing up the New York Times bestseller chart and beyond as America Magazine profiled your experience, becoming an international phenomenon compared to Charles Dickens, one of his own favorite authors, featured on the cover of Time and honored with the National Book Award for Fiction in 1980. A popular movie adaptation of Garp starring Robin Williams, Glenn Close, and John Lithgow also introduced Irving to a new audience. Before all of that kicked off, much like knowing the ending before you were finished writing, had you already settled on The World According to Garp as the right final fit for this particular title?
The truth is, of all my titles, I dislike that title the most. I had always seen it as a working title. It was nothing but a working title. Because of that refrain that I knew would be my ending. In The World According to Garp, we're all terminal cases. Yeah, I mean, that was the ending I was shooting for, and it's a good ending. It works, but it was the title of the novel because I couldn't think of a better one, and I always thought I would. I was still young enough then as a novelist not to know that I should have, with my doubts about The World According to Garp as a title, I should have held that title back. If I didn't like it, I shouldn't have put it on a manuscript. I should have said title to come or untitled, because I was still trying to work on a title when I gave it to my editor, Henry Robbins. And I had never had a response as warm and generous to a novel. And my first editor at Random House had sent me to Henry Robbins because he said he couldn't get the rest of the people at Random House to get behind me, and I should go somewhere where the whole house would get behind me. And he recommended I try Henry. He was right. That guy was a good friend, Joe Fox. Well, Henry's enthusiasm for the novel was wonderful. And Henry and everyone else at Dutton who had read the novel could not imagine the novel with another title. So because of Henry's enthusiasm for it, and everyone who'd read it said, well, it is The World According to Garp. Well, no, not really, I said, but I didn't have anything better. I had sort of failed to come up with something better.
The New York Times quipped way back in 1981, amid all the Garp mania, that perhaps John Irving will now return to his typewriter. Mr. Irving is extremely funny in his novels, and none of this spinach would have gotten off the ground if he couldn't. With black cunning and a swift squeeze and a thumb of the eye, grips us with this masterly storytelling. It enchants, as though the Brothers Grimm and the Brothers Marx had conspired to punch a hole in the evening while Wittgenstein was looking on, shaking his wise head. As the set pieces such as Franny's Revenge on Chipper Dove are wonderful. What did you find most inviting inhabiting the colorful new ensemble that readers meet here in parents Wynne and May Berry and their 5 children, Frank, Franny, John, Lily, and Egg, as you wove their voices and stories together while we were all guests at the Hotel New Hampshire?
I've always felt that a family, there's enough human dynamics in a complicated family to stand beside a town of good size. And if you can get the dynamics within a family right, you can suggest a whole cosmos there. I heard Eudora Welty give a speech once where she said, everything good and awful that likely can and will happen to you in your future lives can happen in a big family, or words to that effect. I'm not quoting her accurately, but it was the first other writer in my life, and a writer I admired, who put a kind of seal of approval on the family as sufficient for the description of a human model in all its complexities, with its troubles and its highlights and its low points. And I felt that was what was a good lesson. A family's struggles, and the element there that was set in motion with the child who's injured and the child who dies in The World According to Garp. The idea that in every family there is a tragedy, there is a lost child or children. There are people who don't go the distance. Well, that kind of suits a model I've been writing to in many of my novels, namely, create characters the reader will love, and then make the reader fearful for what's going to happen to some of them. Because with love is fear. Fear is love. If you love someone, the next step is to be afraid for them. And it seems to me that in the work of a novel, where my intention, not unlike Dickens, is to move a reader emotionally more than I'm interested in persuading a reader intellectually, well, that's how you do it. You make people wary of the very characters who are the most vulnerable, and those are the ones they love.
How attractive is it as an author to be able to make readers find levity in something that they might never otherwise, especially given some of the tragedies that you explore on the page?
Again, to go back to Kurt Vonnegut, he wrote this many times, and to his students, he said it many times. And there was often the remark in the margin of something you'd written, which said, "God damn it, you've got to be kind." And that hit home with me. There may be something exhibited that is purposely cruel, or intentionally hurtful for a reason, but your fundamental reason for doing everything should somehow spring from human kindness, not petty grievances. And, for a guy who had survived as a POW the firebombing of Dresden, it was hard to argue with him.
Franny's is just a character that grabs everyone's heartstrings here and does not let go. From page one through everything she endures by the novel's end, as brilliantly depicted by Jodie Foster in the film adaptation. What brings you the greatest joy about creating strong female protagonists as you do on the page here and have for decades now?
There's a history of very strong and dominant women in my novels, and she's one of the early models. Franny is definitely one of the early models, but Franny's character is repeated in other personae in future novels. It's not a surprise, is it, that there are more positive female characters in my novels than there are positive male characters. And I don't think it takes very much insight to again to recognize that many women are substantially better behaved than many men are, and often do stand out in their families as a leading example and not a bad example. I don't think that's I think that's an observation, not a fiction.
Would Melanie qualify in the same respect in the Cider House Rules?
Yes, Melanie qualifies in that respect, as and Hester in A Prayer for Owen Meany is another Melanie. Nora in The Last Chairlift is another Franny, Hester, Nora. These characters go together. They have they seem to me to have genes in common.
Turning to this legendary book in American literature, TV Guide once described your Oscar-winning adaptation of the best-selling novel as a poignant drama about a World War II-era orphanage in Maine, where a sensitive lad who grows up under the tutelage of the Institute's kindly doctor who performs abortions on the side. How special a place did Dr. Wilbur Larch, Candy Kendall, and Wally Worthington, Angel and Rosie, and all the orphans who bring the St. Cloud orphanage to life hold in your heart, especially against the backdrop of what's going on there behind the scenes and how artfully and authentically you wrote about it all here?
I think it has a special place in my heart. If for no other reason, maybe a kind of wrestler's reason, that it was the hardest. In terms of, before I could even start writing the story, which I had as I always have, a pretty defined narrative map of, but I couldn't begin until I schooled myself in obstetrical gynecological medicine of a time that I could no longer witness firsthand. Yes, a normal childbirth was happening in the same way. A normal D&C was happening in the same way. But the way they did a C-section back in Wilbur Larch's day was not the way they do C-sections at the time I began writing this novel. So I had to spend a lot of time with a lot of doctors in the Yale Medical School. I had to learn and observe and learn and observe. And it went on for so long that I had to repeat what I had learned before because I'd already forgotten it. And one of the doctors who was supervising me, my OBGYN background, so to speak, said, that's why we don't let guys your age into medical school. Well, I was a lot younger then, but it was daunting to learn all that stuff. I saw a lot of childbirth. I saw a lot of standard D&C procedures. It was, I don't have a scientific background, and it was demanding. But I also think it's one of my endings that is a refrain. Princess of Maine, Kings of New England. It's one of those endings that comes back again. And so being an ending-driven writer, I think it's, in a way, the novel that has one of my most gratifying endings. In fact, the working title, the original title for the Cider House Rules, ended up being the title for the first chapter. The Boy Who Belonged to St. Cloud's, I always called it, a much more metaphorical title than The Cider House Rules, which is actual, not metaphorical. But in the long run, at the end of the day, I felt The Boy Who Belonged to St. Cloud's, if it were the title of the novel as a whole, would give the whole story away. The reader would know that when Homer Wells leaves the orphanage, oh, don't worry, he'll be back. Whereas if I kind of buried it in the first chapter and called the novel something else, I could get away with it, so to speak.
The moral complexities facing a character like Homer Wells really do reveal themselves over the lifetime readers spend with him on the page. Would you share a bit about how they first revealed themselves to you as you grew with him through these different eras in his story arc?
He is also a character that appeals to me in that he's in the respect that, think of how many of my characters are kind of, as I was, a slow learner. But when Homer finally gets something, he gets it. But he's a kind of stand to the side, observe, wait and see sort of character, until he's put in a position where he can no longer wait and see, where he has to act. And so the trap I have painted him into, the corner I have painted him into, is that I like the contradiction of this, that I knew I was writing a polemic. I knew I was taking the pro-choice side of the abortion argument. It's a didactic novel. It's a polemical novel. But I thought the best way to make the case is to create a character who has every good reason, every good personal reason, not to perform an abortion. His mother let him live. His mother gave birth to him and walked away. At least she let him live. So that if anyone has a justifiable reason to not want to do that procedure, I thought, let it be a child who was allowed to live, who's going to have a hard time doing that. But here's the trap. If you don't allow other people to do it, someone who knows how has to. As Dr. Larch says when Homer Wells tries to leave St. Cloud, if the women have no choice, why should you? And so I was setting poor Homer up the whole time. He has a good reason to say no. He has a good reason to leave. But ultimately, there's a better reason to go back. And he is confronted with a girl who's pregnant and needs help, and he sees why. And if he can do it for her, well, he can't play God. He can't choose to do it for her and not for somebody else.
Remarkable. Just as Stephen King, in an exclusive review for the Washington Post, called A Prayer for Owen Meany, adding that your next work represented a rare literary creation in the somehow exhausted world of late 20th century fiction. It is an amazingly brave piece of work. So extraordinary, so original, and so enriching that readers will come to the end feeling sorry to leave this richly textured, carefully wrought world. Was your motivation to write here born out of personal connections to that time and through friends who did and didn't serve in the Vietnam War?
I lost some friends in Vietnam, soldiers who died there. I saw what happened to other friends who came back and were never the same. But I also had empathy for those friends I had who upended their lives not to serve, who went to Europe, who went to Canada. And many of them didn't have such a great time either. So I wanted to think, I needed a lot of time to know what I really thought about that issue, beginning with the underlying feeling that it was a misbegotten war and a mismanaged war from the get-go, that everything about it went wrong. And but there was also a residing guilt in my own mind that I had signed up for officer training when I first started college. I was in a ROTC program and thoroughly expected to, finish college with 4 years of military science courses and other ROTC classes, and then serve my time in the Army. I didn't think twice about that. My stepfather was a sergeant in World War II, and he told me once that if I was going to be drafted anyway, that in his estimation, it was a better idea to be an officer than to be an enlisted man. And that's why I signed up for ROTC. I wasn't really making my own decisions. And all that happened to me that ended up getting me out of the whole thing or ever having to make up my mind was that on a junior year abroad, I got a girl pregnant and married her and had a child and didn't even know at the time until the child was born, when I was still an undergraduate. I didn't even know that this would make me ineligible for combat and that I would be summarily dismissed from service, 3A, married with child, goodbye. And one of my officers in ROTC explained to me that the Army had wasted time and money training me, which I had just thrown away. It was a few years after that when people I knew began to die, that I realized the birth of that child, my first child, might arguably have saved my life. But I did nothing to do except a stupid human accident, not being careful about getting someone pregnant. So that I think that residual guilt, the feeling that I did nothing to deserve this ticket out of Vietnam, but a dumb accident that happens all the time, right? I think that is responsible for some of the carefulness with which Owen Meany is constructed in that. And what I mean by the carefulness is that we're led to believe, we're led to expect from the opening chapters of the book that this is a guy remembering his best friend who sounds like he was probably killed in Vietnam. But no, I had a harder or a harsher message in mind. What happens to Owen Meany is that he's not killed in that war, but he's killed in the United States by an American because of that war. So that sort of perverse or twisted reasoning, it seemed to me, encapsulated those mixed emotions toward the war. Owen Meany himself looks upon the anti-war movement very cynically. He looks upon it as the don't get drafted movement. And Owen Meany wants to go there. He's too small for combat, though. But he's going to die because of it anyway. The damage, and I think anyone of my generation is able to see this. The damage that war did to the international reputation of the United States is still ongoing.
The world's most esteemed critics for years have fallen over each other, getting in line to sing the praises of your works. From the nations calling you arguably the American Balzac, or perhaps our Dickens, a rip-roaring storyteller whose intricate plot machinery is propelled by good old-fashioned greed, foolishness, and passion. While the LA Times Book Review found that the pleasures of this rich and beautiful book are manifold. And of course, A Widow for 1 Year is the story in question, where Salon took a deeper dive into the enormously entertaining new novel where it's a measure of his achievement here in the way that the book spanning 40 years and nearly 600 pages. You feel when it's over that you spent your time wisely. It's a robust roar to life from one of our finest storytellers. And before even arriving there, you really hit us with a gripping opening line. One night when she was 4 and sleeping in the bottom bunk of her bunk bed, Ruth Cole woke to the sound of lovemaking. It was coming from her parents' bedroom. Where in priority and importance do the opening chapters of your books rank for you in balance with the rest of the epic stories you're telling like this one here?
Well, I put so much effort into the ending that the beginning is I don't put that much thought into the beginning. Many of my beginnings have been revised. You can finish a book and go back and tweak the beginning. If you change the opening chapter or how the opening chapter begins, it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to change another word of the novel. If you change a later chapter, especially the last chapter, or especially the ending, well, you might have to make a lot more changes. The thing about a beginning is, I've often begun a novel where this is chapter 1 and then decided by the time I got to chapter 5, chapter 5 is a better place to begin, and begun and chose to begin there. No harm done. Easily reconstructed. Because you haven't hooked too many claws into what's going to happen and all the foreshadowing that follows. So beginnings have for me, they're a lot more open, they're a lot more flexible than endings. And I often change them. In fact, I change them so frequently that I can't tell you now whether that exact beginning to A Widow for 1 Year always was. I don't know. It was always in that chapter. Was it the opening line? Maybe not. You can, in an opening chapter, you're pretty free to move things around. And once again, the better I know where I end, the more confidence I have in where in linear time, where in the narrative architecture, the beginning should happen.
As the old adage goes in literature, setting itself is always a character. And India features heavily in the background of both A Son of a Circus and The Fourth Hand. What fascinated you about this storied country and culture to make you want to star it so prominently in both of these novels?
That novel grew out of a screenplay that still hasn't been made, that I was collaborating on with Mary Ellen Mark, the photographer, and her husband, Martin Bell, the filmmaker. And I had gone with them to India and lived with circuses in India because of our interest in the children who were the high wire acts without a net in Indian circuses. And after some years of trying to get that film made in India, we relocated it to Mexico, where there are also circuses, where the high wire acts are children, and there is also not a net. That film now is a part of Avenue of Mysteries, and it might yet be made as a film. But that's one of my novels that began as a film first and became a novel after years of our not being able to get it made as a film. But that was a story that captivated me because my friend Mary Ellen and her husband Martin told me they knew that I had a kind of preternatural interest in damage to children and things that put children at risk. And they said, hey, I have something that might interest you. And it gripped me. It still does.
Since you touched on Avenue of Mysteries, the New York Times Book Review promised others from the first page to the last that there's a goodness to this novel, a tenacious belief in love and the redemptive power of human connection, unfettered by institutions and conventions. This belief, combined with good old-fashioned storytelling, is surely why John Irving is so often described as Dickensian. But the author is his own thing, and so is his novel. Avenue of Mysteries is thoroughly modern, accessibly brainy, hilariously eccentric, and beautifully human. Exemplified by no one as powerfully as Juan Diego and the trip he makes from Mexico to the Philippines to keep a promise. Was his journey one you felt compelled to make personally while you were writing? While you were writing a novel that USA Today ultimately called a dream-steeped, enchanted, and often amusing tale.
Sometimes there's a trip. Sometimes there's a trip that magically, not by design, what I mean by magically in this case, that magically coincides with the book you are writing. Well, in this case, the promise that Juan Diego makes to the gringo, that he will go and visit the grave of the gringo's father, which is in the Philippines. The promise he makes to the gringo is a big emotional investment in Avenue of Mysteries. But the reason I could live up to that promise is that my daughter had a school friend, a girl from the Philippines whose family was making a trip home to the Philippines over one Christmas. And this girl's family invited all of us, my daughter, my wife, and me, to go with them. And I thought, well, now I can see the gringo's grave. I can make good on that promise. I didn't even know if it should be a part of the story. And then fortuitously, this trip to the Philippines just fell into my lap, so to speak. That hasn't happened in the case of any other novel, a kind of fruitful accident or an accident that coincides with a storyline that I was thinking, oh God, how could I do this? In the first place, I don't know anything about the Philippines. Well, suddenly there was a whole family who knew everything. It was their homeland. And they sort of took me under their wings and took me everywhere I needed to go, so that I could live up to that expectation that Juan Diego makes to the gringo. That is one of the feature films in development now, a co-production between Mexico and Canada, which I have a lot of confidence actually might really get made.
Fascinating. Well, hopefully that call's coming at some point in the near future. Good Morning America glowed like everyone who read your more recent work, The Last Chairlift, musing that it's long, but don't let it dissuade you. Let it excite you there's that much new John Irving material to read. His first novel in 7 years takes place in Aspen, Colorado in 1941. It follows Little Ray, a former national skier, who moves back east to have her son. Years later, her grown son returns to the Hotel Jerome in Aspen, where he encounters some ghosts. Read on, you won't be able to stop. What did you find to be the most exhilarating twists and turns at the pen in the ride of writing this latest opus?
I grew up in ski country. Everyone in my family was a skier, a better skier than I am. My reasons for not being as good a skier as everybody else in my family aren't Adam's. Adam has a resistance to learning to ski. I felt no such thing. I was a pretty good skier as a young child, but because of the dominance that wrestling had in my life, and because in high school and college wrestling is a winter sport, for a sizable piece of my life, when I was either competing as a wrestler or coaching wrestling, I was removed from the ski season. So that basically from the age of 15 until I was in my 40s, I was taken away from something that I'd been taught how to do as a young child, which is the easiest way, anyone will tell you, to learn how to ski. I was a good little kid skier, but then I didn't go back to it until I was not just 40, but 47. I couldn't very well tell the wrestlers I was coaching not to ski, because if you've got kids on your wrestling team, you don't want them to break a leg skiing. Um, and I had no time to ski because I was busy in those winter months. But I've lived in a bunch of ski towns. Um, as it turned out, although The Last Chairlift is my longest novel, it was one of the easier ones to write because I didn't have to learn anything outside my own experience. I didn't have to do any research, any travel. I didn't have to do the kind of painstaking learning that I was confronted with in the case of the Cider House Rules. Novels like Until I Find You and the Cider House Rules, which entailed so much learning before I could begin, or A Widow for 1 year, learning about the relationship between the police department and the prostitutes union. Well, the research involved in those novels took as long as the writing time. In the case of Chairlift, it was a great novel to be writing during the pandemic because I didn't have to go anywhere. And 6 years writing time isn't bad for my longest novel. But the reason it took only 6 years is that I didn't have to leave my desk.
On that subject, please take viewers back in time to the night you were sitting at the Academy Awards and it was announced that you'd won the Best Adapted Screenplay Oscar in a category with Tom Perrotta for Election, Frank Darabont for Shawshank Redemption, Eric Roth and Michael Mann for The Insider, and Anthony Minghella. That must have been a crowning validation after so many years of personally shepherding this masterpiece to the finish line as screenwriter.
It was a very gratifying moment because it had taken 14 years and 4 directors to get there. It was not a quickly forthcoming event, getting that film made. And for much of that time, much of that 14 years, it didn't look like it was going to happen. And when it finally came about, the collaboration with Lasse Hallström is honestly the best collaboration I've ever been a part of. We just were together on every page, and I think it shows. I mean, I think it. I think the lack of friction, the totality of agreement between the screenwriter and the director is evident in that film.
Finally, the Paris Review, along with calling you a great storyteller, has called you a generous teacher, and we'd be grateful if you'd make us your students for a few sage moments before we go. What lies and remains at the heart of building a life as full as a writer as you have?
Well, it's easy to say with hindsight that I now feel it was to my advantage not to be successful with my first novel. It was the 4th one that was my first bestseller and allowed me to become a full-time writer. And I think if that success had come too easily, if it had been a first book phenomenon, I might have sort of taken it for granted, but because I had to wait through the writing of 4 novels and to have the time to write every day, all day, I've always considered it a great luxury, because at the time I was writing Garp, I thought, well, this is my life. I'm always going to be teaching English, coaching wrestling, and trying to find time to write a book in between. And suddenly, I got the freedom I asked for. I kept coaching, but the freedom from teaching and sort of gave me a 7-day work week that I'd never had before. And so I've not looked back on that. I don't feel I make myself go to work. I feel it's a luxury to be able to do what I always wanted to do or most wanted to do for a living. That's a luxury. I don't take it for granted. And so I hope I don't say this only metaphorically or imagistically. I really do hope I sort of die at my desk doing it. I see no reason why that shouldn't be the most gratifying way to go, and also the least possible burden to my family. You just have to keep doing it. You just have to find a way to keep going if you're serious about it. You have to find a way to, if it isn't the centermost thing in your life in terms of the time you have to give every day, it can still be the centermost thing in your heart.
John Irving, we were so honored to have you on the show today. Thank you so much for taking our time to be on About the Authors TV.
Thank you for your close and careful reading and your very good questions.